if they can change public policy because the president's feelings got hurt, does this look like a place you want to put money long term? This is what we're talking about in terms of the quality of governance.
On the ExpertsConnect podcast, we have thought-provoking conversations with top-performing experts on topics that matter to you. With ExpertsConnect, you'll uncover fascinating facts and gain the necessary skills you'll need to improve all aspects of your life. Gyude Moore is a Senior Policy Fellow at the Center for Global Development. He previously served as Liberia's Minister of Public Works with oversight over the construction and maintenance of public infrastructure from December 2014 to January 2018. Prior to that role, Moore served as Deputy Chief of Staff to President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and head of the President's Delivery Unit. At CDG, Mr. Moore's policy analysis and research focus on governance, the financing of infrastructure, and Africa's response to the changing landscape of external actors. His focus tracks the policies of traditional, aspiring, and emerging actors on the continent, especially the rise of China and its expanding role in Africa. Hi, Gyude. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. Welcome to the ExpertsConnect video podcast. So today we'll be talking about Africa and the leadership and its economic prosperity. So let's first talk about the economic prosperity. How has Africa's colonial past affected its economic prosperity?
There was actually a paper a couple of months back that systematically observed this question and tried to interrogate it. And it shows that first is the idea of sort of path dependence. Social processes, economic processes become path dependent. So if this is the path, it's sort of like a river. It flows in the path of least resistance and it simply continues to flow in that path. And so the patterns that were established were basically most of Africa that was colonized was a source of natural resources, of raw materials to support jobs and factory and value creation in the colonial power. So basically, most of Africa was at the periphery. When independence occurred, in most African countries, even though people wanted to be independent, they were in no position to run independent states. You didn't have as many educated people. You didn't have as many people to fill technical positions. And so the patterns of trade that were inherited from the colonial era remained, which was basically just continuing to export a natural resource. And so between then and now, there are countries that are trying to make it, but we still haven't had a critical mass of transitioning to industrialization.
Yeah, very interesting. So now that we're in 2021, what are the reasons for the high economic inequality in Africa?
So I keep coming back to this. So basically what happened over time was the richest countries in the world, the industrialized countries, went through sort of these phases of heavy industrialization where most of the jobs were from manufacturing, and then they transitioned into knowledge economies and service economies. But every time a country or a group of countries make that transition, another group of countries come up in their place and then begin the process again. And so one would think, in my view, that when most African countries, when the wars of the 1990s ended, and African countries were basically about to make that transition, they ran into a huge roadblock, and that roadblock was China. China was a massive country. It's basically a continent-sized country. China had the infrastructure. China had a skilled labor force, and China had sort of the conglomeration effect, because if you build a factory here that is doing, say, textile jeans, then next to that factory, you have one that produces zippers. So it's easier to build a factory here because these components and subcontractors are so close to each other. And so China then in 2000 had all of these things, whereas in Africa, you have the same, a larger space, maybe the same number of people, but separate over 54, 55 different countries, 54, 55 different regulatory environments. And so China was way more attractive as a destination for FDI to build manufacturing than say Africa. And so, and China's run continued for, I don't know, 20, 30 years. So China now is getting to that place where it's beginning to focus more on a knowledge economy, on high-tech products. And then the next group of countries will think like, oh, maybe it's Africa's turn. But not really now. It looks like it's going to Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, whereas Africa continues to lag behind. And so as long as Africa continues to export unprocessed agriculture and mineral products to the world without adding value, then the inequality persists, right? So again, we have to disrupt the patterns of trade that were established by the colonial relationship.
This is very enlightening. And what does prosperity look like for Africa? How can we achieve this?
Yeah, well, so I have this thing, I'm trying to make it a thing that I call the Africa Project. And the Africa Project is, in my view, an accumulation of all of our efforts to build a prosperous African society. And what does that mean? A prosperous African society is one in which we can culturally, socially, economically thrive, where millions of young Africans are not forced to leave their homeland as a means of being able to find some sort of economic or cultural fulfillment elsewhere. We have, think about it, there are young people in Africa today who would discount the risk of walking across the Sahara Desert, of going through Libya, of trying to cross the Mediterranean in a leaky boat that is not even seaworthy. Hundreds of people have gone before you who died, and they see there's more promise in doing that than remaining at home. Ending that. I mean, you're never going to, we want Africans to be able to travel anywhere they want. We want Africans to be able to share their talents with the world. But we want a continent where that outgoing is not driven by insecurity, by war, by poverty. It's driven by, the pursuit of, just the same way Europeans, go out into the world. It's not because they're starving and dying from war. Right? That's the kind of things we're looking for. So we're looking for a continent that feeds itself. We're looking for a continent that trades with itself. So the significant amount of trade is between African countries and among African economies. We're looking for a continent that is able to provide the most basic standards of living for its people. And every decade, we see an increase in the quality of life of the African person. That, in my view, is what a prosperous Africa looks like to me.
Great. And Gyude, would you say that education could address this issue?
Without question. So part of the thing is, and we keep coming back to this, is how we think of the economy. In most instances, we think of the economy just in terms of the inanimate natural resource endowment, gold, diamond, iron ore. But if you think of places like Japan, where they don't have a significant amount of natural resource endowment, what they're exporting to the world is the quality of the working population, the innovation that they're doing. So I think why natural resources like minerals, agriculture, and forest products have a role to play. The most important and most valuable asset that Africa has is its people. I just imagine Africans who are living outside the continent, where these kinds of facilities are provided for them to thrive. Imagine, Africans in Europe, Africans in the US, even in the face of racism, in the face of all kinds of institutional impediments, they still thrive, right? Imagine in their homeland if those things were provided. So I think education is really, really important, but also a healthy population.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if we're investing in health, just investing in health itself is a significant contributor to economic growth, because that's less sick days, right? Of people being sick and staying away from work. But it also means that all of the resources we're dedicating just to keep people healthy, those are resources that can be expended elsewhere. So I think investing in human capital, which is the skills, the health, the systems that support that. That is probably the most important thing, even more important than our gold and diamond.
I agree. And how can digital technology improve Africa's prosperity?
Well, one of the things that, and I really, really hesitate to say this because, people have been using it for a long time and it has become almost an epithet, is this leapfrogging, right? Leapfrogging to a certain extent is useful and it makes sense, but there's certain basic infrastructure you can't leapfrog. But there's no question that technology has helped. So, for example, one of the issues we have is just we operate in a low trust environment, and it's almost impossible to build a complex economic system without trust. And so, here in the West, for an example, you have institutions of trust. I may not trust you, you may not trust me, but we both trust the bank, right? So if you give me the check, I simply have to submit that check to the bank, and the bank is going to come back and tell me whether you have money in that account or not, right? So the digital system sort of helps to do that. It helps to create trust where trust probably wouldn't be. The second thing is also that it provides a market that probably wouldn't exist, right? A lot of young people in Africa now that are faced with unemployment have been able to sell and buy goods and services on, say, Instagram Marketplace or Facebook Marketplace. And they're selling and buying from people who who may live on the other side of town, and there's absolutely no way they would have known each other if the platform didn't exist for them to be able to do that. So that helps. The second thing is, as more and more people get online, I mean, one of the things that's become pretty profitable is creating content, creating material that people want to consume. And you have very talented Africans who all of a sudden can create a YouTube channel and actually earn money off a YouTube channel. Or we could do something like the Indians have done, where there was a time where you called into a US firm, like you called into customer service, and someone in India was answering your questions, right? So you have tech firms that might hire people in Africa to do work for them here on this side. And the only reason that's possible is because a digital platform allows them to do this. So the transition to a digital economy or hybrid economy between the digital and the physical and tangible carries significant promise for Africa's economic prosperity.
I really like your insights. Thanks for sharing. So,
no worries, bro.
So you mentioned earlier about China. And of course, we know that China is heavily involved in Africa at the moment in terms of infrastructure. So let's talk about the Chinese-African engagement. So Lotus Wang, in an August 2020 article mentioned, and I'm going to quote, "A large amount of Chinese infrastructure funds has greatly improved the infrastructure level of the entire Africa and promoted economic development." What's your perspective on this statement?
Yeah, I'm one of the people who have, argued for continued Chinese investment in African infrastructure. One of the things you would notice about some of the projects that China have financed in Africa, infrastructure projects, and this isn't just limited to Africa and other places, is that these are projects where African governments, those governments have struggled to raise financing for, where they may have taken it to the World Bank or taken it to bilateral lenders, and they told them that, well, it's not commercially viable or it doesn't make sense. you don't need that project. This is what you need. And so China has come in and provided that. The second thing also is that we have to historically look back at why China was such an attractive partner and how China came to be. So by 1989, the Berlin Wall falls and the Cold War ends. Well, throughout the Cold War, Western interest in Africa and in other places in the developed world was because they were in this ideological battle with the Soviet Union. So you supported whoever was on your side. And when that war ends, when the Cold War ends, there is really no value to continuing to maintain client states. And so the West withdraws. And when it does, and no longer provides support for the strong men they did, a significant amount of turmoil occurred within African countries. So there were lots of coups d'etats, there was a significant amount of wars and civil wars throughout the 1990s. And eventually, while that was occurring at the same time, HIV/AIDS was spreading across the continent, right? So with the wars and social and civil unrest, you have large numbers of people moving across borders, refugees and internally displaced. And in the West, Africa was largely seen through the lenses of development. It was seen as a place of risk. It was seen as a place where the engagement was largely to contain the risks. And one of the issues of the risk, of course, comes in 1998 with the embassy bombing in Tanzania and Kenya. And when it appeared, that global terrorism was reaching out into Africa. And so Africa then, beyond simply being a place of development, it was seen as a place of possible risk. And so the security lenses were applied to Africa. So in these times, as this is going on, there's not an incentive in the West to say, let's build infrastructure in Africa, let's invest in African economies, right? Most of what is done is let's provide development assistance to Africa. And then so China at this time is also coming out. China joined the WTO in 2001. So everywhere else in the world, the Chinese are just not good enough to compete in those markets because they can't compete with the Americans, the Europeans, or the Japanese. And the one place where China is not facing any rivalry in terms of being able to compete, of course, is in Africa, because most people aren't paying attention to Africa in that way. And so, but Africa's greatest need turned out to be China's greatest strength at the time, which was basically infrastructure. And so this marriage was like it was made in heaven, right, between the Chinese and the Africans. The final thing about that is that China didn't really care about the model of governance, whether you were respecting human rights, whether you're doing that. China was willing to give loans to everybody, democratic countries, autocratic countries. Whereas Western engagement was like, are you having free and fair elections? Are democratic rights being provided? Is your public financial management good? Is there high corruption there? We can't deal with you. China didn't care. Right? And so for a lot of African countries that are not very democratic at the time, the Chinese ended up again on this level being really, really good. And so we see over the last 20 years, significant ramp up of Chinese investment, and most of it, more than 46%, maybe somewhere between 46 and 52% of Chinese lending went to infrastructure. And that is what you need if you're going to build an economy. You need roads. Yeah. You need power. Even if you go into agriculture, you need storage, and that storage, you have to control moisture and temperature. That requires power to do that. If you have big farms, you need to be able to get the products from the farms to the market. You need roads and transport links to be able to do that. Well, if you're going to protect people's lives, you have to provide clean water for people to be able to drink and water filtration, right? If Africa is going to be connected to the rest of the world, then Africa needs ports, and the Chinese were investing in all of these things. And so you can see how, if you're an African, you may value your relationship you have with the West, but if they're not providing what your people need, then of course you turn to a partner who does. The final thing that I would say is, and I've said this again and again, that it might seem sort of ironic to people or counterintuitive, but the more democratic African countries became, the more they turned to China. When you go out to vote and when you go out to elections and get votes, well, what is the driving need in almost every African country? Infrastructure. Yeah. So when you run for office, you tell them, when you elect me, I will build your infrastructure.
Yeah.
Well, when you get elected, you turn to the partner who is most capable of providing that infrastructure. So even countries that became more and more independent, democratic, continue to turn to China because China helped them keep the social contract that they had with the electorate.
Great insights. And can we say that the African leaders embrace the relationship with the Chinese government because of the infrastructure and the electricity that they provide?
Yes, definitely, definitely. But also, like I noted, also because China came with no strings attached.
Yeah.
China did not demand policy reforms within those countries as a basis of being able to invest there.
Okay. And Gyude, why do you advocate that China is a suitable business partner for Africa?
Well, because, like I initially said, is that what is the binding constraint to economic growth in Africa today? If you ask me, I would say it's infrastructure. What is a compelling Chinese strength that's building infrastructure at cost? It's not as if European companies and European construction companies cannot build infrastructure. They can. They generally built infrastructure before the arrival of the Chinese. The problem is that European construction is expensive, compared to the Chinese. So, as long as you have good supervision to ensure that you're getting high quality stuff, as long as the Chinese were able to provide comparable quality in terms of the infrastructure at significantly lower cost, then it made very good sense to get the Chinese. The final thing I would say is that when Chinese companies arrived to do infrastructure projects, even in instances where the African government did not have the money, the Chinese companies came backed by policy banks in China that were willing to extend loans to African countries to build infrastructure. Now, there's questions with that, but they extended loans in places where they knew that countries could not actually afford to service those loans. And they end up making things. But that's a conversation I want to have later. After I have infrastructure, we can talk about the loans.
Yes. And one more thing, because you were Minister of Public Works in Liberia, how would you assess the quality of the infrastructure that the Chinese provides?
You know how when you go to the store, depending on what department store you shop in, we see the quality of the stuff you come out with, right? If you go to, this is not a knock on H&M, right? But if you go to H&M and buy your clothes from H&M, the quality is different from someone who goes to Saks Fifth Avenue, right? I say it's the same thing in a lot of places where there's this saying in business that you don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate. So if you go to the market and you pay little money, you get, not the best quality. So I think there were instances where, complaints about the quality of works that the Chinese companies were doing. But then the Chinese companies have also built high quality infrastructure. So I think this is an area worth considering. And I think the way African countries can ensure that they get consistently high quality from their Chinese contractors is to be able to also hire construction supervision firms to ensure that you're getting what you pay for. But in my experience as Minister of Public Works, all of the large projects where we hired Chinese firms, we also had an engineering firm to supervise the works and ensure. And because of that, we have no problems with what the Chinese did for us. We got high quality product out of that. And if we could achieve that in a country like Liberia that's really poor, I can't imagine why, bigger African countries are not able to achieve that.
I agree. And remember, you mentioned that about the loans that African governments are amassing from China. So what's your perspective on these large loans or large debts? Yeah.
Well, look, debt is a problem in Africa, but debt is not uniquely a Chinese problem in Africa. Well, there are about 7 or 8 countries in Africa that are heavily indebted to China, but we have 54 countries on the continent, 55 if you count the Western Sahara. So 7 out of 54, So when we talk about Africa's debt to China, we're talking Angola, Kenya, Ethiopia, Djibouti, Sudan, and I think one of the Congos, and so we're not talking Nigeria, we're not talking South Africa, right? Yeah. And so again, the larger group of creditors to Africa are private creditors, African countries that are taking loans, issuing Eurobond debt. So we're talking about Western wealth managers who are investing in African loan products, African sovereign loan products, right? And then you have the multilaterals, your World Bank, African Development Bank, right? Who are also lending in large quantities to African governments. It is a combination of all of this borrowing that leaves Africans with this. So I think it's important to us to continue to speak about the debt issue and the sustainability of the debt we take, because the problem is, and this is what's beginning to happen in a place like Kenya, where debt servicing cost now is going up to $11 billion. If you're spending almost all of the revenue you're collecting simply servicing debt, then there's no money left to invest in health, in education, in anything else, because you're just doing debt. And that no country wants to live like that. So the debt question is definitely one to talk about. I just don't want to talk about it in isolation as if it is a uniquely Chinese problem. It is not.
Okay, and do you have any ideas on how we can address this debt problem?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is what I do for a living, right? And that is how can we diversify the sources of funding for financing infrastructure in Africa?
Yeah.
And the best place would be the private sector.
Okay.
Right? Because the private sector has a significant amount of money. Some private sector wealth managers, they have a longer time horizon over which they can deploy their capital. But there are two problems facing Africa when it comes to this. One is that globally, investment infrastructure as a proportion of the portfolio of wealth managers, infrastructure is not very big. And because infrastructure isn't so big, infrastructure is isn't fully developed as an asset class. What do I mean? It means like almost every infrastructure project is bespoke. You have to start from scratch. You have to do everything. There are no templates, right? If you wanted to buy a stock today, you can just go and buy a stock.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's easy to invest in a stock, but if you wanted to invest in infrastructure today, it doesn't exist like that, even in the West. So that's the first problem. The second problem is a heightened perception of risk in Africa. Africa is seen as inherently more risky. And so if Africa is perceived as so risky, then private capital is hesitant to deploy in a market that is so risky. And so if we can reduce the perception of risk in Africa, it is possible that we might increase the volume of private money that is going into African infrastructure. So some of the things that I think about and write about is how can we reduce the perception of risk, both the perception and the reality of risk in Africa.
Okay, I know time is running, but I'm very curious because I'm also very passionate about this topic. So can you just give us a few insights, maybe one or two, on how we can reduce the perception of risk in Africa?
Well, first is something that the African governments themselves have to do, right? This perception of risk might be perception, but it's sort of like, you know how they say, if there's smoke, there's a fire.
Yeah.
Right. So African governments have to govern better, because the risk is that infrastructure, the life cycle of infrastructure is really long, sometimes between 20 to 100 years. And if you're going to put money into the infrastructure, you want to be sure that 15 years from now, the government doesn't change its policy.
Yeah.
Because you're going to be invested for such a long time. So if the governments are able to demonstrate commitment in the long term, that's one. The second thing is, if we can find a way to, I'll give a quick example. If I went to take out a loan, but I don't have good credit, and you have good credit and you're a good friend of mine, you can accompany me into the bank and co-sign the loan with me. Yeah. The bank takes your credit as a basis to be able to extend credit to me. Now, if I pay back the loan in time, then over time, my own credit improves so that I can go and get credit by myself without you. The World Bank, the African Development Bank, they all have really good and consistent credit. Is it possible then for them to be able to extend their credit, just as you would with me, to African governments who may not have credit, right? Who may not be able to do it, allow them to be able to attract private financing. The private financing and private financier feels better about investing in the project because of the presence of the World Bank, because of the presence of the African Development Bank. And if the African country consistently pays that back, over time, they might be able to attract financing on their own without getting the World Bank to come to them. So I call this sort of like synthetic credit. And synthetic credit is based off the true credit of, say, the World Bank, and the World Bank then creates an artificial credit that it extends to the country and allows the country to be able to do that. I think those are ways of being able to do that. The final thing I would say is that private capital can also invest with African firms. So you have Africa 50, you have the Africa Finance Corporation that are investing in infrastructure. So if you're afraid of fear the risk, then invest with a credible African partner who allows you to be able to do that. I think those are three ways, but most importantly, if African governments can improve the quality of governance in their own country, that will make their countries more attractive for private sector.
Yeah, I was just about to say that, and also if they can improve transparency to the public,
without question,
the rest of the world.
Without question. I mean, one of the things that you have to think about. Look, today we're talking about Nigeria. The Nigerian president tweets. One of the tweets, like a thread, one of the tweets gets reported to Twitter. Says it violates Twitter's terms of service. Mm-hmm. So Twitter deletes that tweet. The Nigerian government gets upset and says, we're going to ban Twitter indefinitely. So they do. And then someone from the Attorney General's office goes on air on CNN and says, anyone who's tweeting will be prosecuted. Now, if you're a private person looking to invest in Nigeria, you're beginning to question yourself if they can change public policy because the president's feelings got hurt. Does this look like a place you want to put money long term? This is what we're talking about in terms of the quality of governance. Of all of the problems in Nigeria, is this the most important thing for the Nigerian government to be on today? Absolutely not. You have the military that is deployed in 32 of Nigeria's 36 states because of insecurity. You're not going to focus on that. You're going to focus on Twitter. Yeah. I mean, what percentage of Nigeria's population is actually on Twitter? What influence does Twitter have? And above all things, how do you change public policy because the president's feelings were hurt? So if you're trying to attract the private sector into your country, this idea that laws are capricious, that they're arbitrary, and people can just change them anytime they want, it creates this perception. It sort of inflames the perception of Africa being a very risky place to invest, and that creates some of the problems we're trying to solve.
Gyude, these insights are so enlightening. Let's talk about the sixth diaspora.
Yes.
Yes, and in a previous conversation that we had, you mentioned the diaspora as the sixth region in Africa. Can you expound on how we can benefit from this sixth region?
Yes. So first, is North, South, East, West, and Central Africa. Those are the 5 regions in Africa. And the African Union has spoken about Africans who, it doesn't matter when they left the continent. Those who were forced off the continent through slavery, those who voluntarily immigrated off the continent. The diaspora are just people of African descent, regardless of where they are. From Brazil to the Caribbean to India, wherever you will find people of African descent. Yeah. There's this idea that they're connected to the continent, and we are connected because of our common history. So Ghana tried to take advantage of this in 2019, because 2019 was 400 years since the first slaves left. And so it was called the Year of Return. And there were Black people and people of African descent from all over the world who came to Ghana. What Ghana did in that year is basically what we're trying to do forever, right? Is the idea that, regardless of where a person might be, as long as this person has African roots, that their talents, their skills, their capital, their expertise will be useful and needed on the continent, and we can find a way for us to be able to do that. That will benefit. But one of the first benefits of this is, like I said from the beginning, when most African countries became independent, they didn't have the skilled workforce to be able to build a modern state. And today, human capital remains an issue in Africa, right? So if we can have Africans who are in the diaspora, skilled, who can come to Africa and be able to provide their skills, absolutely, that helps us move better. The second thing is capital. You have Africans who are in those markets who might have capital that they might deploy in. So I'm from Liberia. If I became wealthy here in the United States, I understand the Liberian context in a way that someone else may not. Yeah. If I return to Liberia and invested there, that's me taking capital from here to invest it in Africa. That's someone in Jamaica who makes money in Jamaica and decides like, you know what, I'm going to open up a new business in Ghana. I'm going to open up a new business in Kenya, right? And so now he brings both his capital in terms of money, but also in terms of his expertise from the business he has in Jamaica and starts the exact same business in Kenya or in Ghana. All of a sudden, market is now he's on a continent of 54 countries. He can open in Botswana, he can open, and as his business grows, just that's it. So, or you might have a Swedish citizen or a German citizen who happens to be, his parents or great grandparents came from, I don't know, Antigua, right? And he's in Sweden, and he has this really, really incredible scale. He has a startup, but he believes that his startup will do really, really well. Well, in Rwanda, they're trying to have something called Innovation City. And Rwanda is trying to push itself as a tech space. So he goes to Rwanda, creates a company, creates value on that company. And so then when we think of the diaspora as the sixth region, it is this idea that everyone who has some sort of connection to the continent is welcome to the continent. They can bring their global networks, they can bring their global skills, their global expertise to help to build this prosperous Africa that we spoke of from the beginning.
Great. And I'm a Caribbean girl, Jamaican specifically. So I'm more curious about how the Caribbean can benefit from partnerships with Africa.
So this conversation, I'm going to start this conversation in a way like someone currently in Trinidad and Tobago might not fully appreciate what I'm saying, but over time they will. Yeah. One of the issues we have in the Caribbean right now is the issue of population. The Caribbean isn't growing in terms of its population. In fact, the population decline is a serious problem for the Caribbean for a number of reasons. One, it is a lot of the young people from the Caribbean end up in Canada or in Europe or the United States. They leave, right? Mm-hmm. And so then, and obviously they do everything they can to send money back home, they go and visit back home, but they've built lives for themselves outside of the Caribbean. At some point, for the Caribbean society to remain viable, you need citizens, you need people to be able to do that. Well, where else in the world are people going to come from who want to move to the Caribbean and have children, not move to the Caribbean to retire, but young people who are going to move to the Caribbean and have families outside of Africa? Well, logically, of all the places in the world, population is actually stabilized or is declining. The one place where population is actually still growing is Africa. So if I were thinking long-term, 20 years, 30 years about the future of most Caribbean countries, that it makes sense to me to begin to improve my relationship with African countries, right? It is the idea that I want to encourage people from African countries who want to come to the Caribbean, or encourage people from the Caribbean who want to go to African countries, because in the future, the very viability of Caribbean countries is going to depend on population. And this is, so I think in terms of the importance to the Caribbean, because without population, you face an existential threat. Will Jamaica continue to exist? Well, Jamaica probably will, but the smaller ones, right? If they continue to lose their population, the final thing I would say on that question is like, even in the Caribbean countries where the young people don't leave, the more the women get into the economy and start working and get more opportunities and begin to focus on careers, they're going to either put off having children or not have children or not even have children at all, because now they have opportunities. So I think that's one of the things. The final thing that I would say also is that, look, if there is a Nigerian or a Ghanaian who, has done business in Nigeria and Ghana for a while and sort of feels like, the space isn't what I would like it to be, I want to be able to invest elsewhere. well, maybe you could invest in a Caribbean country, right? In terms of being able to do that. So I think exchange between Africa and the Caribbean would make a lot of sense. A lot of the Caribbean countries have done really, really well in terms of developing tourism.
Yeah.
And they can work with African governments to be able to help them develop the tourism industry too, to make them attractive for people to come there. But most especially, they could come with their private tour companies and be able to establish those businesses there. So I definitely think that, you know, it is in the interest of both Caribbean countries and Africa to increase the extent of their exchange and back and forth movement between the two places.
Yeah, I agree with you. And you were Minister of Public Works in Liberia. So, what were some of the most important lessons you learned during that experience?
Yeah, well, I guess the most important lesson that I learned was that leadership matters.
Mm-hmm.
Leadership matters.
Yeah.
Whoever is leading the country, whoever is setting the tone in the country. And I like to tell this story that when I was in the president's office as an aide, where the president works, our version of the White House, there was a fire. So the president moved to the top 2 floors of the Foreign Affairs Ministry. There were 6 floors. So 1 to 4 was Foreign Affairs, 2 to 6, 5 and 6 were presidency.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had, like, the elevator didn't work sometimes. So we had to walk up the stairs. And one day I was walking up the stairs and there was these 2 young men, who were much younger than me, but they worked at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But they were walking side by side and the stairs is not that big. So I was walking behind them and I couldn't help but listen to their conversation.
Yeah.
And the 2 of them were talking about a third person they knew, a mutual friend. And the one guy was saying that the third person, the mutual friend, was upset with him because he came with a document to sign, but he refused to approve it because he felt like even if he approved it, the Ministry of Finance would not honor the document because it didn't have an underlying receipt or something. But basically, they were talking process.
Yeah.
This is a country where just a few years before there was a civil war. This is a country where everything had broken down. Now we have 2 young men. I didn't even know who they were. That's how low they were in the bureaucracy, who were talking about systems. Now, why is Liberia at a place where these 2 young men are having this conversation? Because we have a president who was making promotions based on merit. So every young person in the country felt like the more skills I acquired, the better chance I get to move up in the society.
Yeah.
So we were moving away from a society where you had to be connected. I became deputy chief of staff of the president. I didn't know anyone in the president's office. I was professionally recruited. The entire team that I ran in the presidency was professionally recruited. When I became Minister of Public Works, the promotions that I made were based on merit. So all of a sudden, there was an incentive in society to become, more skilled, to go and get better education, to get better skills. And I think the only reason that happened was because of the message and the tone that was being set from the top. So if we're going to change Africa, if we're going to transform the continent, then you don't want just one president who does that. When she leaves office, you want the next president to either do exactly the same or better. And if we can do that for 20 years, 30 years, I guarantee you, we'll see what Africa becomes. And so if there's any lesson that I learned at all, it is that leadership matters.
Yeah. Leadership matters. And we spoke that transparency matters. Also, just trying to build better governmental relationships. Is there anything else you'd like to say in terms of how we can improve the leadership in Africa?
So, we already talked about, how much investment are you making in human capital? Mm-hmm. So I'll also talk about, in our time in office, one of the things that we did was called the President's Young Professionals Program. And the President Young Professional Program was a way of slowly professionalizing government. So every year, there were sometimes 25, sometimes 32 young people who were selected from a very big number of applicants. So it was very competitive. They had to graduate with a certain GPA, local universities. They were recruited and then they had to take the civil service test. And they were brought into the government and placed, say, with someone like me, sort of like a mentorship position.
Yeah.
And then at the end of 2 years, they got absorbed into the civil service, which is why they took the civil service test. Well, all of the young people who came with me, first of all, every single one of them went and got advanced degrees. Some of them are still in government. Some of them are in the private sector. And one of them just got married recently. Right? But imagine if you just continue to do this every year, imagine the kind of society you're building. And at some point, we began to think of, can we connect it to the private sector too? Right? Can we do something like that for the private sector? But again, it comes back to this question of leadership matter. This was a president who was in her 70s.
Wow.
Right? And who recognized, like when I was an aide, she, said that if she won a second term, she was going to give young people more responsibility. More than, I think it was like 60% of the country was 35 and younger.
Yeah.
So at some point you had to have them. So when I was minister, there were at least 6 of us ministers who were in our 30s. At the deputy level and assistant minister level, you have people in their 20s, right? I mean, but basically what happened then, everyone understood, like you had to do, it wasn't like, oh, I had to know someone to get a job. It was like, I was good at what I did. That's why I got the job. Of course, it still takes, luck because, you have to be seen, right? Yeah. But I think if we're going to sort of transform this continent and change this continent, this kind of stuff takes time.
Yeah.
It is not evident. You don't look and see it. It's not like a bridge. It's not like a road. It's not like a building. When you build people, the result is felt 10, 20 years into the future. So you need leadership that is committed to investing in something they might not see, right? You need leadership that is invested in knowing that when the results come from this, when the fruits of this are collected, I will not be here. I will not be the president. But because I love my country, because I want to build a legacy for this country, I'm going to invest in something where the fruits are going to come out 20, 30 years down the line. And until we get away from just focused on the next election, just focused on remaining in power, just focused on short term, then it's hard to build, the kind of country we want. And so President Sirleaf, I'm biased saying this, but she was not just an inspiration. She was a mentor, and she was to me. If by the end of my career I have achieved even half of what she did, I would consider myself immensely successful. And I think she created an example for what. And we came out of almost 2 decades of war. And this is the path on which she decided to put the country. And so I think this is what is needed. I think the more of this we see, and the final thing that I would say is that I hope more and more young people can run for office. Yeah. There is this perception that politics is dirty. Yeah. And that politics is corrupt and only corrupt people are in politics. But if the good people stay out of politics because they feel like it's dirty, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Then the only people who are drawn to politics are exactly the dirty people, right? And so my hope is that people see it as a sort of public service. I was in the government for 9.5 years, almost a decade. Obviously, I don't want to do government stuff anymore, but if every citizen gives at least 10 years of their life to public service, I think we'll get there.
Yeah, this is very interesting. And what's your final message to our audience?
I finished high school in refugee camp. Yeah, in Côte d'Ivoire. I finished high school in refugee camp. If you had seen me in refugee camp then, and you see what I do now and the platform that I have now, where I am now, there is nothing in my past that foreshadows my present. And the reason I bring this up is not as a form of being able to boast, but to be able to say to people that trend does not equal destiny. Simply because things look bad today, because look at Liberia. I mean, there was a time when the entire country was torn apart by war. There is an entire generation of young people in Liberia today who do not, when you say to them the war, they don't know what you're talking about. Yeah. So, yes, sometimes it's very frustrating. Sometimes you look at our countries and you think like nothing will ever change. What I say to you is that the path from being a refugee to being a minister, to be at Georgetown University, to be all of the things that I'm doing now.
Yeah.
If I'd only made my choices based on what I saw, I wouldn't be where I am. Sometimes to change requires us to dream, to believe, to understand that, yes, this is my reality, or realities change, right? So my hope and what I would say to your listeners is that, I don't know what it is. Each person, every one of us has some sort of dream. Every one of us have these aspirations of what we want to do and how we want to get there. All I will say to you is that, stick with it. Nothing that is worth having comes easy. And so if it is something worth having, if a prosperous Africa is something, a prosperous Blackness, because, wherever we are, we face all kinds of difficulty. If that's worth happening, then we have to. And then we have to remember the thing that I said. Maybe at the end of all your efforts, you don't see the fruits of everything you work for, but your children do though.
Yeah.
Or your sister's children do though. So, and I think everything we benefit from today, there were people who came before us who made sacrifices, and some of them are not here to enjoy it. So believe, and I think a better Africa is possible, and that's what we're working.
Powerful message, really, really touching the core of me right now. Very, very deep. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks for reaching out. And again, I'm sorry it took a long time for us to do this, but it's a pleasure, and I'm glad I got to do it.
Yes, I'm happy to have you. So have a good evening. Cheers.
All right, take care. Bye.
Thanks for tuning in on Experts Connect. Please head on over to TeachSomebody.com and give us an applause. You may share your comments and ask your questions in the comment section. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, as well as follow us on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts. You can also follow me on Instagram at Kadian Davis Owusu. Have a lovely rest of the week. Bye.